the roommate. I should have known something was wrong the moment I met Luke. I had just moved into my new apartment, a tiny 2-bedroom in a rundown complex near campus. The rent was dirt cheap, which should have been my first red flag. But I was desperate. The landlord introduced me to Luke the day I signed the lease. "He's been here a while," the landlord said, clapping Luke on the shoulder. "Quiet guy, keeps to himself." Luke smiled, but something about it felt off. His eyes were dark, sunken, like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Nice to meet you," he said, voice barely above a whisper. I forced a smile. "Yeah, same. I didn't know then. Didn't know that moving in was the worst mistake of my life." At first, things were normal. Luke kept to himself, barely spoke. He spent most of his time in his room with the door shut. At night, I'd hear him whispering. First, I thought he was on the phone. But the more I listened, the more I realized he wasn't talking to anyone. It was like muttering to himself. I told myself it wasn't my problem. I should have left it alone. But then the scratching started. It happened at night. A faint, scraping noise from inside Luke's room. At first, I thought it was mice. The place was old, so it wasn't impossible. But then I noticed something worse. Luke wasn't in his room when it happened. I saw him in the kitchen, standing in the dark, staring at the wall while the scratching sound continued upstairs. I swallowed hard. "Hey man, you hear that?" Luke didn't move. For a long moment, I thought he hadn't heard me. Then slowly he turned his head. Not all at once. Just a slow, mechanical shift like something moving a puppet. His eyes locked onto mine, and he smiled. "Go to bed," he whispered. I went to bed. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I checked his room while he was out. I know I shouldn't have, but I needed to know. The door was unlocked. Inside, the walls were covered in scratches. Deep, jagged grooves running from floor to ceiling, like something with claws had been trying to get out. The air reeked, like rotting meat, and then I saw it, a mattress with no sheets, a chair facing the corner, and a mirror covered in black handprints. My stomach clenched. I turned to leave, and saw Luke standing in the doorway. His eyes were wide, unblinking. "You shouldn't be in here," he said. His voice was wrong, lower, almost like there were two voices speaking at once. I stammered something, some excuse, some apology. Luke didn't move. He just smiled. Then, very softly, he whispered, "Do you know who I really am?" I didn't answer. I left. That night, the whispering was louder. And it wasn't just Luke anymore. I heard another voice, a deep, guttural rasp, speaking a language I didn't understand. I pressed my ear against the wall. Luke was talking, but not to himself, to something else. Then, the scratching started again, but this time, came from inside my room. I spun around, heart hammering. Nothing, just darkness. Then, a shadow shifted in the corner. Something tall, something watching me. I bolted for the door. The second I touched the handle, Luke's voice whispered from behind me, "You can't leave." I turned. Luke stood in the doorway, head tilted. His smile was too wide, and his eyes, they were completely black. I don't remember running. I don't remember getting in my car, but somehow I did. I drove all night, not stopping, not looking back. I didn't even take my stuff, just left. The next morning, I called the landlord. "I need to break my lease," I told him. The line was silent. Then, a sigh. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said. My blood ran cold. "You knew," I whispered. The landlord hesitated. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "Luke isn't real." I swallowed. "What?" "He was the first tenant," the landlord murmured. "Lived there alone. One day he just stopped existing, like he was never there. But sometimes he comes back." My skin crawled. "You rented me an apartment with a..." I couldn't even say it. The landlord sighed again. "You're lucky you got out." Then, before he hung up, he said one last thing. "Whatever you do, don't go back." I never did. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I hear scratching. And I know, Luke is still looking for a roommate. When I first met Daniel, he seemed completely normal. I had just moved to the city for work and was desperate to find an affordable place. After weeks of searching, I finally found a listing 2-bedroom apartment, cheap rent, and only one roommate. Daniel answered the door with an easy smile. "Hey, you must be Ethan. Come in." The place was clean, minimalistic. A little too plain, but I wasn't picky. "You cool with splitting groceries?" he asked as he showed me around. "Yeah, sounds good," I said, trying to match his energy. "Great. Just one thing," he added, stopping at the hallway leading to the bedrooms. "I work nights sometimes. If I'm not around, don't go into my room." I nodded. "Yeah, of course." I didn't think much of it at the time. I should have. The first few weeks were fine. Daniel was polite, quiet, and mostly kept to himself. But then things started happening. It began with small noises at night, soft scraping sounds, like something dragging across the floor. At first, I assumed it was Daniel moving furniture or pacing in his room. But sometimes, I'd peek under his door and see darkness. Not even the glow of a phone screen. It didn't make sense. Then there were the whispers. Late at night, just beyond my bedroom wall, I'd hear murmuring. First, I thought he was on the phone. But the more I listened, the more I realized he wasn't talking to anyone. He was praying. One night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. Daniel stood in the doorway, just standing there, in the dark. His breathing was too slow, too controlled. "Daniel," I whispered. He didn't respond, didn't move. I reached for my phone, fingers shaking, and flicked on the flashlight. The moment the light hit him, Daniel turned and walked away, shutting the door behind him. No words, no explanation. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I confronted him. "Hey man, were you in my room last night?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. Daniel sipped his coffee, his expression blank. "No," I frowned. "I saw you." He met my gaze. "Then I guess I was sleepwalking." I forced a laugh, trying to ease the tension. "Well, just maybe lock your door at night. You freaked me out a little." Daniel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sure." That night, I locked my door, but the noises didn't stop. Scraping sounds, whispers, and something new, footsteps. Not just pacing, something moving in circles, like someone walking around my bed. But I knew my door was still locked, right? I turned on the lamp. The noises stopped. The room was empty, but the air felt wrong, like someone had just been standing right next to me. The next day, Daniel didn't come home. His door was shut. Curiosity burned in my gut. I told myself I wouldn't go in. But then I saw the scratches. Long, jagged grooves on his door, like something had tried to claw its way out. My stomach tightened. Screw it. I turned the knob. It wasn't locked. Inside, the air was thick, like rotting wood and something worse, something foul. Daniel's bed was just a mattress on the floor. No sheets, no pillows, and on the wall, hundreds of Polaroids. All of me, sleeping, eating, sitting on the couch. Even one from last night. Me in bed, eyes shut, a dark shape looming over me. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. That's when I saw it. The trapdoor, half hidden beneath his bed. I hesitated. Then I heard the front door open. Daniel was home. I dove into the closet. Footsteps creaked down the hall. My heart pounded. I peeked through the slats. Daniel stood in the doorway, head tilted. He knew. He could feel I was in there. Then slowly, he smiled. "I told you not to go in my room," he whispered. Something moved under the bed. A low, wet groan. Daniel turned toward it. His voice changed, deeper, hollow. "Don't worry," he said. "He's not leaving." I ran. I don't remember getting out. Don't remember calling the cops. But somehow I did. When they arrived, Daniel was gone. His room was empty. No Polaroids, no mattress, no trapdoor. The landlord swore Daniel had never existed. Said the apartment had been vacant for years. I moved out the next day. But every night, I wake up at 3:16 a.m. to footsteps circling my bed, and the feeling of a smile watching me from the dark. When I first met Ryan, he seemed like the perfect roommate. I had just moved to a new city for work and was desperate for a place. The apartment was cheap, clean, and came with just one other tenant. Ryan was polite, normal, a little too quiet maybe, but I didn't mind that. There's only one rule, he told me the day I moved in. I work late sometimes. If I'm not home, don't go into my room. I laughed. Yeah, man, no worries. At the time, I thought nothing of it. I should have. First, things were fine. Ryan worked nights, so I rarely saw him. The apartment was quiet, which I liked. But after the first week, I started noticing strange things. At night, I'd hear muffled voices through the walls. At first, I thought Ryan had people over. But when I checked, his door was shut and locked. The next morning, I asked, "Hey, did you have someone over last night?" Ryan looked at me like I was crazy. "No, I wasn't even home." I forced a laugh. "Right? Must have been the neighbors." I wasn't convinced. And then came the scratching. I woke up one night to a soft, scraping sound. It was coming from inside the walls. I sat up, heart pounding. Mice? No, this was different. Deeper, like fingernails dragging along the wood. I pressed my ear to the wall. A whisper, so faint I almost didn't hear it. "Help me." I jerked back, heart slamming in my chest. It had come from Ryan's room. The next morning, Ryan was already at the kitchen table, stirring his coffee. I swallowed hard. "Hey, do you ever hear weird noises at night?" Ryan's spoon froze mid-stir. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, in a slow, careful voice, he said, "It's an old building." That's when I noticed something. Ryan's fingernails. They were cracked, splintered, like they'd been worn down from scratching something for hours. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I stayed awake. At exactly 2:47 a.m., I heard my bedroom door creak open. I held my breath. Through the darkness, I saw a shape in the doorway. Ryan, standing still. His breathing was slow, too controlled. "Ryan," I whispered. No response. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked away. I didn't sleep after that. The next day, Ryan left for work. I stood outside his door, heart hammering. I shouldn't go in, but I had to know. I tried the handle. Unlocked. Inside, the air was wrong. Thick, rotten. The walls were covered in scratches, deep, jagged grooves. And the smell, like something old, something dead. Then I saw it. A trapdoor in the floor, slightly open. I stepped closer. That's when I heard it. A whisper from underneath. "Please, don't let him put me back." I staggered back. The voice wasn't coming from Ryan. It was coming from something under the floor. I turned to run and slammed straight into Ryan. His face was blank, expressionless. His fingers twitched at his sides. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered. My throat closed. "Ryan, what the hell?" Something moved behind him. The trapdoor creaked open wider, and a hand, gray, bony, inhuman, reached out. Ryan smiled. "You shouldn't have let it out." I ran. Out the door. Down the stairs. Didn't stop. Didn't look back. When I finally called the cops, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. They checked the apartment, but there was no Ryan. No trapdoor. Just an empty room with deep, claw-like scratches on the walls. The landlord swore I had been living alone the whole time. I moved out the next day, but sometimes late at night, I hear scratching, and I know Ryan is still looking for a new roommate. I should have trusted my gut when I first met Devin. The Craigslist ad seemed too good to be true. Large apartment, cheap rent, only one roommate. When I arrived for a tour, Devin answered the door with a stiff smile, eyes shadowed by dark circles. "You must be Adam," he said. Something about his voice felt off. Hollow. Still, I needed a place and the price was unbeatable. "One thing," Devin said as I unpacked later that night. "I have insomnia, so I stay up late. If you hear me moving around, just ignore it." I nodded, not thinking much of it. That was my first mistake. For the first few nights, things were normal. Devin kept to himself, barely left his room. But then, at exactly 3:14 a.m., I woke up. First, I thought I had imagined it. But then I heard it. A slow creaking sound coming from Devin's room. I listened, holding my breath. Creak, creak, like someone was rocking back and forth on an old chair. I glanced at the clock. 3:16 a.m. Then suddenly silence. My skin prickled. The next morning, I casually asked, "Hey, you up late last night?" Devin's spoon froze in his cereal. He looked at me blankly. No, I was asleep. A chill crawled up my spine. The next few nights, it got worse. At 3:14 a.m., I'd wake up to the same creaking sound, but this time it was closer. Creak, creak, coming from outside my door. I held my breath, my heart hammering. And then, a whisper, so soft I barely caught it. "Let me in." I bolted upright, sweat slicking my back. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I decided to stay up the next night. I turned off the lights, pretended to be asleep, and waited. 3:14 a.m. The air in my room changed, like all the warmth had been sucked out. Then the creaking, slow, deliberate, creak, creak. I clenched my jaw, barely breathing. And then the whisper, "Let me in." It was right outside my door. I reached for my phone, hands shaking. I opened the camera and switched it to video. Then, gathering my courage, I lifted it toward the door, just enough to catch the hallway in the reflection of the screen. My stomach dropped. Someone was standing outside my door, tall, wrongly shaped, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its feet, they weren't touching the ground. I shut my eyes, gripped the blanket. Minutes passed, then silence. I didn't sleep. The next morning, Devin was making coffee like nothing had happened. I stared at him. "You sure you don't sleepwalk?" I asked. Devin chuckled. "Nope. Why?" I forced a smile. "Just wondering." I didn't tell him. I needed to know more first. I waited for him to leave. Then, with my pulse hammering, I checked his room. The air inside smelled stale. The bed was untouched, like no one had slept in it for weeks. But the worst part? The rocking chair. It sat in the middle of the room, facing the door, and the floor beneath it, deep gouges from the legs, as if someone or something had been rocking there for a long, long time. I turned to leave and saw the mirror on his dresser. My stomach twisted, because in the reflection, the rocking chair was moving, and something was sitting in it, watching me. That night, I packed a bag. I was done. At 3:14 a.m., I was already awake. Then, a noise, not creaking, scratching, coming from inside my closet. A whisper, "Let me out." Couldn't breathe. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Devin. "Don't open it." I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching my blanket. The scratching stopped. But I knew I wasn't alone in my room anymore. Something was watching me, waiting. And then, ever so softly, it whispered, "I'm already in." I moved out the next morning. Didn't pack. Didn't tell Devin. Just left. Days later, I got a call from an unknown number. I didn't answer. It went to voicemail. I hesitated. Then slowly I hit play. Static. Then Devin's voice. "You let it out." Then creaking sound. And a whisper that wasn't his. "Let me in."